Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comic, film, TV, movie, and video game industry. And of course, I'm your host, Kurt Sasso. We're on episode 378, joined today by another very talented comic creator in the industry, and I'm glad everyone's been really enjoying these interviews. So I appreciate everyone that's been commenting and downloading and watching this on the YouTube and the iTunes and all that stuff. So thank you so much. We are joined by a creator of not only an iPad app, of various children's comic books, as well as a very talented artist in his own right. Please welcome Jeff Weigel from jeffweigel.com. How are you doing today, Jeff?
I'm very good, thanks.
All right. Well, good to hear. Good to hear. It's kind of funny. I usually get the occasional email out of the blue, and usually it's a simple matter of saying, well, I'd love to come on your show and do an interview. You gave me a symposium, basically, of...
Sell job. It's called a sell job.
It was a good sell job, I have to admit it. It's really
good.
well
I'm glad
done.
to hear that.
I've
I'm
never...
get better at that part of my job, is the selling part.
Well, it was a very passionate appeal to be on the show, so I'm like, well, let's get him on. This is going to be rather entertaining. So, for those that don't know about yourself and your work, give us a brief rundown of what you've done in your career.
Well, for the last, I don't know, well, I should say that I've been a comic book artist, since I was a little kid, basically, the way so many others start up. And I studied graphic design and became a graphic designer in college and worked for many, many years, actually, as a graphic designer. But all the time, I was sort of interested in doing comics and visual storytelling, basically, of one kind or another, all through my years as a graphic designer, and I sort of did it on the side, too. I guess my first published work was for Big Bang Comics, and you interviewed Gary Carlson just recently and talked about the history of Big Bang. I was one of their prominent artists. I worked with them pretty often. I did for them. They published some stories about a character called the Sphinx under their Big Bang imprint, even though that was done, most of it was done sort of before I even had met them. But it seemed like a good fit for their mission and the mission that I was trying to accomplish with those works. And so I did the Sphinx for them, and Gary also enlisted me to do things that he had scripted too. So I was sort of their main Silver Age Ultraman artist on those books too, usually being asked to ape a style similar to Kurt Swan's from the 60s Superman books. My work has always been compared to guys like Kurt Swan and Murphy Anderson and a lot of those sort of very some of the more tight Silver Age artists, especially DC artists. But I've done other things besides that too. I've also been working, after I had done a lot of work for Big Bang, I decided to see if I could break into the children's market. And so my first attempt to do that was to do a picture book that was sort of comics based. It's about a character called Atomic Ace, who's, this is one of the Atomic Ace books here. And it's basically a kid's picture book about a family whose dad is a superhero. And that proved pretty popular. That was done for a Chicago publisher. We did a sequel for that. And after that, I did a graphic novel, the first graphic novel that G.P. Putnam and Sons had ever done for a kids' market too, a book called Thunder from the Sea, which was this historical epic sort of a thing based around a kid's adventure during the Napoleonic Wars on a British naval ship, so it was a historical thing. And then other things that I've done, spot illustrations for these books that proved very popular. One of them ended up on the New York Times bestseller list. It was a book of rewritten Christmas carols to be about zombies. It was this sort of Mad Magazine type, rewriting the lyrics of famous songs by a writer named Mike Spradlin. And so I did, 50 or so spot illustrations for that first book, which was called "It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Zombies," a book of zombie Christmas carols. And that thing proved really popular and ended up on the New York Times bestseller list back in 2009.
That's amazing.
We did a couple of sequels for those. One was a book of love songs called, I have to refresh my memory.
Every zombie
eats somebody sometime, yes. Right here.
That's nice.
And we did another one of nursery rhymes called Jack and Jill Went Up to Kill. And we also did, with Mike Spradlin, I did a picture book called The Monster Alphabet. So there's a different monster for each for each letter of the alphabet. So it's like C is for Cyclops, and A is for Abominable Snowman, and things like that. That was a lot of fun. But, I've always tried to gravitate back to comics whenever I could. And this last year, I got a chance to do the newest book that's coming up, which is really my first really huge, big-scale graphic novel sort of thing. And that is Dragon Girl, this book that's coming out in June from Andrews McNeil. I don't know if you're familiar with Andrews McNeil. It's a Kansas City publisher, but they do tons of comics. They do a lot of collections of famous newspaper strips like Dilbert. They did that big box set of Calvin and Hobbes that was put out a bunch of years back, and Get Fuzzy, and a lot of things that are under their umbrella. Particularly Dragon Girl is a book that is for the children's market. They have an arm of their operation called AMP, and it's basically comics for kids. So they're making a big push on creating comics, fresh new comics with new characters by new artists for the children's market. And that really dovetailed right into what I see as my mission, because I'm really dedicated to this idea of doing comics for kids, because that's a market that's sort of underserved these days, oddly enough, considering the history of comics. And it used to be all about comics, and now there aren't even very many kid-friendly versions of standard superheroes like Batman and Superman. So I'm trying to sort of fill that hole, hopefully, and also to do it in a way that reacquaints kids, or not reacquaints, newly acquaints kids with some of the style of adventure comics that I grew up with, more classically illustrated sorts of things that are more in the mold of Hal Foster and Alex Raymond and a lot of the Silver Age artists. So that's sort of my mission, and that's kind of why theoretically I attracted your attention with my email.
It was very detailed, and I'm glad you came in to do this, and I appreciate it. The kids market, the children's market, I should say, seems to be a particularly difficult market for graphic novels, comics, however you'd like to call them, to get in. I know a lot of comic creators that I know and that I've interviewed in the past have or are currently in the market itself, but even trying to get new content for that market seems to be very difficult. There isn't a push like there was back in the 80s and 90s.
Well, it's a weird sort of a thing, it seems to me. I'm not sure how much interest the mainstream comic book companies have in that market, just judging by the product that they put out. They make attempts at it every once in a while, but when I look at it, I'm not terribly impressed by it, because it tends to be sort of very broad, very cartoony, and it just doesn't seem to reflect the things that lit me up about comics when I was the age that they're trying to appeal to. When you're 9, 10, 11, 12, in that age range, everybody talks about how the golden age of comics is when you first discover comics. It's around those ages, but there's not very much product for kids to have that golden age anymore. And it's my hope to try and create at least some of the stuff that they'll get excited about, and will acquaint them with a lot of the things that I loved about comics when I was a kid.
Well, I find it interesting with your art style. Just in looking at the various images, it reminds me of back when, especially your Dragon Girl imagery, reminds me of the old choose your own adventure novels with the that type of dark contrast between black and white and the detail of the characters and everything like that. And
Right. Well, I learned what I tried to emulate was that sort of sense of lighting and volume and composition that I learned from the guys that I admired, which was Raymond and Foster, and a lot from Kenneth, and those are the big three that everybody in the following, in the generations of artists who started out in comic books, those were the guys that they admired from the adventure strip category, and they all sort of took their lessons from them. And so guys like Alex Toth and Infantino and Kurt Swan and the Buscemas and guys like that. They all started out in the 40s and 50s, and Raymond and Caniff and Foster were their starting point for how they drew in a lot of ways. They evolved into their own style, and I have the same inspiration. I just find those sorts of craftsmen really interesting, and I just really love their artwork, and so that's sort of who I have set my goals for. Not to say that I'm anywhere near as good as those guys, but you got to start somewhere, and you got to have a target to try and hit, and so those are the guys that I take my inspiration from. And but to go back to your original point about
the market,
a lot of comic book artists trying to crack that children's market. The point I was trying to make when I brought up the majors like DC and Marvel is their sort of lack of interest in that. It's sort of a side game to them, if it's any kind of a game at all. But that's not so for some mainstream publishers. I have found over the last, 10 years or so, maybe a little less than that, that there are a lot of mainstream publishers like Andrews McMeel and G.P. Putnam and Scholastic and all those big children's publishers that everyone's familiar with. They're interested in the graphic novel area, but it's not something they understand very well. I should say, with the exception of Andrews McMeel, because they've been in the comics business for a long time. But I think a lot of these other children's publishers don't really understand the medium very much, and so I suspect they don't know who all these unemployed, really talented craftsmen from the comics world are to try and approach them. And I think it's vice versa. All these comic book people that know how to tell stories well and would like to tell stories to kids, I think maybe they don't manage to see beyond the comic book companies that they're running across all the time. Their mindset is DC and Marvel and Image and Dark Horse, and then there's a bunch of independents. But I'm not sure that it occurs to them to try and send a proposal to Scholastic or Andrews McMeel or one of these other sorts of places. And I think that's why those two parties that can bring this stuff in front of kids aren't talking to each other enough just yet. Hopefully they'll discover each other sometime soon.
For me, I found a number of independent creators, webcomic creators, as well as those that are coming from a comics background to go online. Especially when it comes to the kids market, they're at least making the effort to showcase an online version of what they're trying to get strictly published. Maybe a limited run of 5 or 10 pages or whatever, but enough to gain interest so that they can sell it to a Scholastic or whatever. It seems like Scholastic is really making a push for these graphic novels for the young kids.
Yeah, and there are places that are interested in this kind of thing. There's a publisher called First Second, that does things for kids too. I'm not sure. They're a division of some larger publisher that I'm not sure who it is. It may even be Scholastic or like Simon and Schuster or somebody like that. But in fact, so many of these publishers are under one huge umbrella or another, sort of buried down in the pile, you know.
Yeah.
So, but it's a hard market to figure out. I have the advantage of having an agent now who finds homes for these things. So I don't have to try and figure out who's sending it to. I have an agent named Steve Chudney, who's very familiar with the publishing world. And, you know, I just put together a project and send it to him, and he figures out what the best home for it might be.
It's good to have someone helping you out. It's
Yeah, it
difficult
sure
to do
is.
things solo.
Makes a huge difference because I hinted before that I'm not very good at marketing myself. You know, us comic book artists are used to, you know, hunkering down in our studios and just spending all our time focused on our drawing boards and our ideas. And when it comes to trying the part of the job where we have to go out into the real world and sell ourselves, it's much more difficult for us and for our personality types. So I'm lucky to have somebody like Steven watching out for me and figuring out how to get my work out into the world.
Yes, that whole business marketing aspect, it's
Yeah.
a pain in the butt. I'm looking at your other works too, and not only are you a very talented comic artist
Thank you.
and very, very talented in terms of the number of books you've put out, and of course an iPad app is always amazing to have. Let's talk about the iPad app technology-wise. I mean,
Sure.
what was that concept, or where did that concept come from, I should
Well,
say?
you know, that started out, that my iPad app is a storybook app. It's an interactive storybook app. And it actually started out as a book proposal that I couldn't find a home for. And that's an important thing to say for guys like me. You know, there are more aborted projects, things that you never find a home for, than there are the things that you actually will sell through. Stop Math was one of those things. I sort of became really interested in science books and astronomy and things like that back when my kids were in grade school. And I decided to do a book to try and tell kids a little bit about what math can be used for beyond what they're usually taught in school, which was, you know, calculating the speed of trains and, you know, figuring out how much money you have in your pocket and things
Darn
like
you,
that.
calculus.
So, you know, all those things are good, but what they don't really talk about very much is things that Einstein and Isaac Newton did to sort of reveal what the universe is really like. And they did it with mathematics. And I wanted to do a kid's picture book about that. And that became Stop Math. It's the story of this little kid who lives in the future, and he really hates his math homework, and he decides to use his parents' time travel helmet that they invented to go back in time, find out who invented math, and to stop them from inventing it so he won't have to deal with this anymore. So he manages to do that with his robot dog widget, and he goes back in time, and during the course of trying to figure out who invented math, he crosses paths with Albert Einstein, who gives him a little lesson in what math is good for and what he used it for. The same for Isaac Newton, and the same for an Arabian mathematician who popularized the use of Arabic numerals, our standard 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 through 9, as opposed to the old Roman numeral system, which was, you know, X's and L's and I's in various orders that made it really hard to do standard mathematics for common people. So, and the great thing, I guess the way this came about, like I said, I did it as a picture book. And I sent the proposal out to publishers. And it's always the same story with these sorts of things, is that you got to go through a lot of rejections before you find somebody who's actually interested, if you do at all. And that was the story for Stop Math. From one place you'd hear, we like the story, but we don't like your artwork style. The next guys would say, we like your artwork style, but we don't really like this story very much. And then the next guys would say, well, we like your artwork and we like your story, but unfortunately we've already got a math book on the list this year, so we don't really want another one. So it's always this very complex network of excuses for why you can't find a home for these things. A few years ago, when the iPad came out, and I've always been this big Apple enthusiast too, so anytime they release something new, it's always very interesting to me. And I saw the first children's books apps that were created for iPad, and I was just so amazed by them, even though they're a little bit primitive by the standards of what they can do with it today. But they had all this interactive animation in it where you touch characters and they'll have a little action to them, or just the sort of standard things that you can't do in a printed picture book. And I was just so blown away by that I said, I've got to do one of these things. I've got to find out if it's possible for me to do one of these things. And I decided to use StopMath as my guinea pig for this project. And the great thing about it is that with the interactivity, it allowed me to do a lot more than you can do in the course of a normal picture book. So with the interactivity, not only on every sort of page, so to speak, of the book, do I have a little animation, the characters, a little movement, but also there are places in the book where I can do these interactive diagrams to help explain the concepts that I'm talking about. Like when he meets Einstein, I can actually do an interactive demonstration of a little aspect of how relativity theory works by showing how the faster you move closer to the speed of light, how time will be slower for you than it is for someone who's stationary back on, say, your home planet. And the kids can control the speed of the rocket ship and see how one person ages faster than the other, things like that. The same for Isaac Newton's theories about gravity, and the same sort of interactivity goes for a demonstration of the difference between Arabic numerals and the old-style Roman numerals. So it just so expanded my ability to tell that story. And the other thing I liked about it is there weren't any gatekeepers, too, because you can create these things, and you give them to Apple, and as long as they work as promised, and there aren't any bugs in them, and they don't crash their iPad app, then they go in the App Store. And anybody from anywhere in the world can, from the comfort of their Wi-Fi living room connection, find this thing and download it. So the app's been downloaded by people all across the globe, literally. I get sales from Australia and China and things like that. It's just an amazing sort of way to get your work out there. But I'm always looking for a new way to get my work out there.
Well, especially with the internet now, and I think a lot of creative people, yourself included, are taking advantage of the internet the way it should be, or at least you're getting yourself out there and marketing yourself a lot more than what you used to do, which was not really understanding the internet for what it is in terms of connection, networking, a marketplace of sorts, along the lines of advertising as well, revenue in that regard. I mean, there's so much aspect you can do with yourself as a comic creator, as a business person as well, too. So
the great thing about the technology of the last 20, 30 years is how it's democratized what people want to do. It's helped eliminate the gatekeepers, and it's also opened up our abilities to talk to our own audience, and it's also opened up our abilities to actually do the work, too. Before, I've been in the graphics business long enough to remember what it was like before there were computers involved in this process. When I first started out, I was using rubber cement and pasting blocks of type down on artboards that then went to a stat camera. And nobody had any notion of using computers for this sort of thing. And, I've seen that whole progression of how you can go through the whole process yourself, how you can really take the reins of your creative project and handle it all yourself, from the typesetting to the coloring to know, until sending files to a printer to be able to print a book. Or maybe you're not printing a book at all, maybe you're printing an iPad app. It's just an amazing thing.
Mm.
I mean, I know comic book creators who aren't even using pen and pencil anymore. They're working on their Cintiq tablets in Photoshop or Illustrator or
Manga
Manga
Studio.
Studio. And in fact, I'm experimenting with that a little bit too. I'm just now starting to get involved in uh, digital painting in Photoshop, full digital paintings. And I bought my first copy of Manga Studios to see how that would work for me too. So I haven't done a lot of experimenting with that, but I try to keep up. Anyway. Although there's no way to keep up exactly. You hope you don't fall too far behind the wave.
But yeah, you're talking to an old computer guy for 20 years in the industry, so I've seen the advancements as well. And I recently switched to visual arts, communication, media, and film for university. I went back to school, and so I've seen the changes, and my experience is just like yourself, how you experienced the change from traditional all the way to digital.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing the same thing when it comes to technology and computers and film and everything like that, and it's amazing, and it's wondrous what's been used and what's been created, and it's only going to get better, hopefully. So
it's amazing in so many ways, not the least of which is how it's opened up the artists' abilities to do their work.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't have done these books back in the old days, because I would have required a typesetter. I would have had to have color separations made of the paintings that I had done for these books. There's just so many things that I would have to go to an expensive service bureau to accomplish. And now it's to the point where, I can do it all, and I get to handle every aspect of the creative process. From, like I could never hand letter to save my life, but I don't have to anymore. That gives me the chance to really open up my abilities to create these things, and it's just a terrific, wonderful thing.
And it's like you're finally getting the creative freedom that you've wanted all this time, the ability to do multiple areas like you've been discussing,
right,
and seeing. So
well, what always happens with these things is it shows you ways to do things that you never it's not a matter of sitting around going, I don't know how to do this part of it. It's like it never occurred to you that you could do this part of it at all until you saw this technology that was available to you, and suddenly it really opened up your mind about what you could accomplish. So that's almost the amazing part of it, is it sort of drags our expectations along with it as it advances.
in terms of creativity, though, it's definitely different for every creator. For yourself, though, when do you feel, or what do you feel, I should say, is your creative impulse?
Well, I have set out to do several missions with my career. And one is to pay homage to the people that taught me and inspired me, the people that I never met, people like Kurt Swan and Hal Foster and those sorts of guys who just lit up my childhood. So the first thing I want to do is to do what I can to keep those guys remembered. And part of that, I might have mentioned in my email to you, what part of that mission for me was to design a book about Kurt Swan's career called Kurt Swan, A Life in Comics, that was published about 10 years ago by Vanguard, David Spurlock's imprint. He does a lot of books along those lines about the careers of some of the titans of the comic book industry. And Kurt Swan's book was one. It's this sort of coffee table thing. It's got a biography of Kurt, a lot of interviews with comic book professionals like Alan Moore and Carmine Infantino, a lot of guys that were inspired by Kurt, and also a lot of Kurt's contemporaries. The book was written and put together by a comics historian named Eddie Zeno, and he approached me about designing the book for him. And with my graphic design background, that sounded like a great deal. So we put that together. That was the Eisner Award nominee, I don't know, 10 years or so ago when it came out. And so that's the part of what I try to do that sort of keeps those guys and their inspiration alive for new people. It's also great to see all the stuff that's being reprinted, all their work being reprinted now in collections that are both expensive and dirt cheap, you know, things like the showcase editions and the Marvel Essentials. That way those guys' work can live on for new generations for a long time to come. We're also, I'm not sure how much I can tell you about this, but Eddie and I are collaborating on a new sort of companion volume to the Kurt Swan book the career of another sort of Silver Age legend artist. And I won't tell you who that is because I'm not sure Eddie would want me to just yet because it's still in the works. But
Fair enough.
that's the part of paying that forward that I'm trying to work on. The other thing is to teach kids about comics, and I do that through teaching that I do. I teach a Saturday comics course at a St. Louis organization called COCA, it's Center of Contemporary Arts. And so Saturday mornings I teach classes where kids actually will do comics, and at the end of the semester it's like a 15-week class.
Wow.
At the end of that time I'll take their artwork and put it together into a comic book, and we'll actually have it printed, and they each get a copy of their work and everybody else is in that issue of the comic book. So we're in I think we just finished our 4th issue of Coca Comics.
Wow.
This last May.
I was going to ask about that actually. That's great that, you know, the grade school era are getting a real taste of, you know, professional comicking, and hey, there's another generation to inspire people after them.
Yeah, these are kids that are about, well, I think the youngest I've dealt with was 8. The oldest was like 12 or 13. Wow. And what I try and do is teach them, you know, the basics of comic book storytelling and a little bit about figure drawing. And then the last half of the semester is usually letting them take that from there to sort of come up with their own crazy ideas and come up with their own comic book stories. So it's very interesting to see what they end up with. Mm. And then the last part of that 3-legged stool that I think of as my career is, of course, to do new comics that carry on the traditions and inspirations of the guys that inspired me. Mm. So that's where things like Dragon Girl come in, trying to tell stories as interesting and as captivating and as stimulating to readers' sense of wonder as, you know, Superman and early Marvel comics and all that kind of stuff was to me.
No, definitely, I completely agree, and it's wonderful to really, you know, you see that after all this time, your inspirations are really what you're passionate about and what you continue to be passionate on, which is, of course, your comics and everything like that. So let's talk about yourself in terms of your creativity when it comes to when do you feel in what areas do you feel you're most creative, and what areas do you feel you're a little less creative than you should be?
Well, I'm a better artist than I am a writer. So, and the artist part of this has always come first for me. You know, I always wanted to be a comic book illustrator, but I wasn't finding collaborators. I wasn't always finding, I should say, collaborators whose material interested me that much. And I should say an exception to that is Gary Carlson. I've worked on some of his scripts, and they were always a great amount of fun, and I always enjoyed doing that Big Bang stuff for him. But in terms of telling stories, I had a hard time finding writers that told stories that I wanted to contribute to. And so sort of out of necessity, I started trying to write my own. And it just worked out. It dawned on me that a lot of the finest comic book creators were also those writers slash illustrators. Guys like Will Eisner
Mm-hmm.
and Jack Kirby and Joe Kubert when he wanted to be a writer. You know, he did such a great job on Tarzan in the 70s
Yeah.
and a lot of other things too. Obviously, he's a terrific writer. You know, the guys who were really giants either were writers too or had the ability to construct stories. And it just occurred to me that there was no reason to try and divide up those skills into one compartment or the other, the way the comic book industry has always sort of tried to do, I think sometimes for less than admirable reasons. I have a theory that a lot of the reasons that the tasks of writer and artist and inker and letterer were all divided between different guys had as much to do with the economics of comics and editors wanting to try and keep a rein on each different aspect and sort of keep those things in different pockets so that they could control them a little bit better. But you know, I see them all as a part of the same whole at the end of the day. You know, the best way to figure out how to tell a story visually is to first have a story that you're really excited about telling, and to think about how that story unfolds, at least for a guy like me, is going to be visually. And so the idea of writing and figuring out how to show these things visually is all part of the same process. You know, when I work on these books, it always starts with a plot first, and then the visual second to layouts of, you know, how many panels does this break down into? What do I show? What don't I show? What's my timing? What's large? What's small? What's a close-up and what's a long shot?
Mm-hmm.
All of those sorts of things come first before the dialogue does. And I lay out my pages, and then I will dialogue them after the fact. Because, and it's not that they're completely separate processes, but at least that way I sort of think about them all together. You know, plot and visuals and dialogue all work together to make these stories, and it helps for one person to be able to think about all of them at the same time, I think. Helps me anyway.
Yeah, definitely the storyboarding aspect and making sure you understand where things are being placed, and it's a lot larger process if people just pick up a book and say, oh well, you know, they did this all digitally. No, there's a step-by-step process you have to follow.
Right, and you know, I think that's what a lot of children's publishers have trouble wrapping their heads around in terms of comics too, because you see a lot of kids comics that don't really seem to understand some of those processes very well. I think that there are a lot of editors, because they're not really used to comics, and because I think that people in the publishing industry, editors in children's books, sometimes think of comics as this sort of weird stepchild. You know, it's sort of the bargain basement version of what they try to do in picture books. They don't understand the medium well enough, and so they think it's just a matter of plot, and then somebody writes words, and then somebody should draw pictures to go with those words. And they don't think about the sort of storytelling details and the appeal of the visuals that comic book artists like Eisner and Steranko and Kirby and Ditko, those sorts of guys, understood so well. They're missing that part. These children's book people are missing that part of the equation, because they're not familiar enough with the medium.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that. And eventually they'll come around. They'll understand, and
Well, hopefully. Yeah, hopefully. But you know, you look at a lot of the graphic novels for kids, and they don't seem to understand those principles very well. And like I said before, I'm not sure that a lot of the editors know that the talent is out there. They just don't know where to look for it.
Hmm. Well, let's continue on with yourself here, because when you look at what you've done, when you look at Dragon Girl, let's take Dragon Girl specifically in this regard, um, because that's your newest book coming out soon. So when you look at Dragon Girl, when did you feel that it was a finished product?
Um, when I finished the last page, I suppose. The process that I went through on Dragon Girl, uh, I don't know, it doesn't quite track the way you're thinking of it. I don't think. I conceived of Dragon Girl as a completely different story, to be honest, and proposed it to publishers that refused it until I came to the folks at Andrews McMeel, or more correctly, until my agent went to Andrews McMeel with it. And Andrews McMeel said of the proposal, we really like your art style and your storytelling style and the art pages that you've given us. And there were only maybe a dozen or 15 of those as part of the proposal. They said, we like the artwork, and this is really the kind of book that we'd love to do, but we're not that crazy about the story for different reasons that had to do with things that their marketing sense in the children's book industry have led them to think are pros and cons to these sorts of things. For instance, they told me there were too many adults in the original version of Dragon Girl that I had. Kids want to read about themselves, they want to be the central character, they want to live in their own universe, and they don't want adults to be that big a part. The Dragon Girl in the original version had a mother and a father and an uncle, that sort of thing. It was more of a family story. Anyway, so I spent some months going back and forth with them, revising the story until it evolved from what I started with until it was something that they were happy with and that I was happy with. And I think that they're savvy about their market and they're savvy about comics because, as I said, Andrews McMeel does a lot of comics.
Yeah.
Really helped the thing along. It turned it into much more of an action-adventure thing than I had originally envisioned. And that suits me just fine. My editors at Andrews McMeel, Andrea Colvin, and Lane Butler, who originally started on the project with me, were really terrifically helpful in helping me figure out what this thing should be and in steering me in the right direction, and also having the sense to leave me alone when I was doing the right thing too, which editors that I've worked with in the past haven't always had the sense to do. So they were just incredibly helpful to the process of creating this thing. But to sort of steer back to your original question, the way this thing evolves is once I had it in a form that Andrews McMeel decided they were happy to publish it. My years in graphic design have left me very methodical about how to go about these things, and I knew this was going to be a bigger project than I'd ever taken on before because Dragon Girl is 192 pages, and it's all me from start to finish, from pencils to inks to script to plot to lettering, even to layout. And so the first thing I did was I had a story outline, and then I started doing thumbnails of what all the pages were going to look like. Plotting out all the action that was going to be happening and what needed to be shown and what didn't need to be shown. And I ended up with a stack of 192 thumbnails for how the book was going to go. And after that, I translated the thumbnails into full-size pencils, rough pencils for each page that were then scanned into the computer, and then I scripted on top of those before I did final art. And that way, if I had a little more dialogue than I expected to have, I could move figures around in the panels and shrink things down and make sure everything fit together the way it needed to. And then those pages I would run by 10, 20, 30 at a time over to Andrews McMeel and get their edit suggestions on it. Once the whole book, all 192 pages of it, was done that way with rough pencils and script and word balloons in place, that was when the biggest part of it, which was to finish all the artwork, came in. And so it was a matter of doing the final inking on everything at that point. So that's my working process. It's it's pretty methodical, and I don't know. You're making decisions all along the way, but um, it's not like I'm sort of wandering in the dark. From the time I finish those thumbnails, especially, I've got a pretty complete picture of what this thing is going to look like, and it's just a matter of execution at that point. Even though that's a good 70 to 80% of the work that goes into it. Yeah. So.
No, it's a lot of work either way. So
Yes, it is a lot of work. It was basically, 50 hours a week every week last year. Probably some of that time accounted for, other commercial illustration assignments to help pay the bills and things like that. But the vast, vast, vast majority of the effort that I put in at my drawing board and computer last year was Dragon Girl, and it really was the year because I started at the contracts were sealed at the January 1st of 2012, and I turned in the last page on January 1st of 2013. No, I should say 2014. I should say December 31st is when I turned it. In other words, it took a whole year.
and many sleepless nights, I'm sure, as well too.
No, my work method is very, like I said, methodical, and it's not. I don't spend a lot of late night hours. I'm very much a start in the morning and work through to like 6 in the evening, and then probably more on Sunday too. And sometimes I work a little farther into the evening because there was just that much effort involved in it. But I try not to burn midnight oil the way a lot of cartoonists do.
Sleep? What's that? That's for the weak. Anyhow. But let's continue on here. When it came to Dragon Girl, obviously, you're very methodical with everything, like you previously mentioned. Was there any creative mistakes or happy mistakes, as Bob Ross used to say, that kind of cropped up that turned out well?
Well, I'd say that the creative mistakes were probably in earlier versions of it that the editors helped me weed out, and they helped keep part of my mission in focus was to make sure that there's a lot of character and humor to the main character. They were looking out for those sorts of commercial considerations that you can sort of lose sight of because you can't see past the weeds all around you, as you're working on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. So they really kept me mindful of making sure that my main character, Alana the Dragon Girl, had a lot of personality and had good motivation across the course of the story, and just was somebody that you'd want to spend 192 pages with. So in terms of things I learned across the course of the book that helped me streamline my work process, I did this in a way that I hadn't done before. With each big project like this, I learned a couple new things about how to be more efficient, to really work better and smarter. One of which was for Dragon Girl. Most of these pages, instead of I used to do my rough layouts and then light board those layouts onto Bristol board, and that always cost me, an hour or so at least of that translation from roughs to tight pencils, and that cost me an hour of time. And when you're talking about a 192-page book, that's a lot of time, an hour a page. And so I discovered a way to get around that by actually printing blue line versions of, and I know other guys have done this. I just sort of discovered it on my own, but I think there are a lot of cartoonists who do this now. I discovered after the fact. I'll actually print blue line versions of those rough pencils off on my 11 by 17 inkjet printer onto the paper I'm going to do the finished artwork for. So now I don't have to tighten those pencils anymore. I'll just take those roughs and I'll start inking right on those things. And that saved me a ton of time. And I ink, 90% of my inking is done with a brush, with the old standard Winsor Newton brush that everybody else knows and loves. And then I've used micron pens for some of the tinier details, for some of the more mechanical sorts of details, like if you're doing buildings or anything roughly mechanical. But I'm a big believer in the brush. I sort of came across, inking is another task that I came by because I couldn't find anyone to collaborate with whose inking I was happy with over my pencils. I started out with the same mindset that a lot of other comic book artists do, which is, well, I'll just do the pencils and somebody else can ink. And somebody else can write the stories. I'll just take their scripts and somebody else will do the lettering. Well, I could never find collaborators I was happy enough with and ended up adopting all of those skills just out of necessity. But a big inking breakthrough for me was encountering Alex Raymond's Rip Kirby. His brushwork on that strip just sort of blew the top of my head off when I first encountered it. And I said, I got to try this. I've got to quit trying to use these pens that end up so, mechanical. This is a skill that I really would like to understand better. These deep blacks that he has and the shadows, the fluidness of his line work that comes from that very analog sort of tool like a brush. And so I mentioned before the work I had done for Big Bang. The first Sphinx story that Gary asked me to do was just this 12-page sort of introduction to the character. And I decided that I was going to try and do that whole thing with a brush, just as a challenge to myself.
Oh.
And I even remember inking the panel borders with the brush, using, like, holding the brush and using the edge of a ruler to sort of steady my hand to do the straight lines. But that was the goal I had set for myself. No pens involved at all. It had to be all brush. Wow. And it was just a terrific learning experience. And I kept Rip Kirby at my side the whole time to try and remind me of what it was supposed to look like. It looks a little crude these days when I look at it again. All the Sphinx stuff was collected into a paperback edition last year by the guys at Pope 2.0. They're reissuing a lot of the Big Bang stuff. And my Sphinx stuff all made it into one volume, so I had a chance recently to sort of revisit all that stuff and see what my old weaknesses were. So I remember looking at that story and remembering what a learning experience it was for me as I first picked up the brush and sort of made myself figure out how to work it.
Yeah, it's I recently fell in love with nib and ink as well, with like calligraphy type pens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I just something about that just gives you the colors, the contrast, the colors, especially if you're using a certain type of paper and all that stuff, and the ability to like, I was using a lot of colors and all that other stuff as well too. So I was mixing colors of inks and just having a real blast with some acrylic Indian ink stuff.
Right. Well, it's really sort of a big part of making the creative process enjoyable is trying to remove as many obstacles between your vision of what you want and how your hand can create it, with as little effort as possible, right? And some guys are managing to do that with the computer, but that analog brush stroke that you can make tiny, just a pinpoint thin to nice and fat with one stroke, all in one stroke, I find that hard to beat. I tell young artists all the time that they really have to enjoy the process of doing these things. It's one thing to be happy to be an artist or a writer and say, this is my book, to have it in your hand. But if you don't enjoy the process of getting there, you're going to have a miserable existence.
Mm.
So you've got to be able to sit down, in my case, and in the case of comic book illustrators, at that drawing board and really love that experience of hitting the paper with your pen or your brush and getting just the stroke you imagined it would be.
Mm.
Lay that thing down. I remember the joy of working on some of those Sphinx issues as I was figuring out how that brush would work. And I remember in that quiet room, you could hear the sound of the brush just sort of lightly touching the paper, and you could hear when it picked up, and you could see at the end that line was exactly what you were hoping for. And you got to be able to take satisfaction from that process, or you probably shouldn't be in this business.
Completely agree, and it's great to hear that you challenged yourself, and I don't know if a lot of comic creators get to do that, or if they just kind of fall into a rut of, this works for me, I can get this done quickly, why do I need to challenge myself?
Yeah, I mean, I can see the other end of the spectrum too, is that you're trying to make a living at this too. Yeah. So there's always the part of you that's worried about how fast your output is, and how much you can get paid for any given assignment, those sorts of things. I mean, that's got to be a part of being a creative person trying to make a living from it too. So that journeyman mentality is also a useful part of doing this job, and hopefully you find the right blend of both of those things. Guys like Kurt Swan certainly did. And I know from working on his book that I'm sure there were days when he wanted to do anything except put his butt down in that seat and draw another picture of Superman. But at the end of the day, you find the fulfillment in it somehow, hopefully. Or on the day when you're too burned out to do it anymore, hopefully you find a way out of the business. There are a lot of comic book artists that wanted out of the business by the time their career was over too. So, but a lot of that had to do with how well their publishers treated them and how exploited they felt. Yeah. And I think about the fact that Jack Kirby, near the end of his career, finally decided he was giving up comics. To think about Jack Kirby giving up comics is just mind-boggling. And it wasn't that Kirby didn't want to do them anymore. It's just he felt so misused by the business that I think he felt it. He must have felt it wasn't worth the pain of that anymore. That's a terrible testimony to what the comics business was and has been. But hopefully, all these creators doing indie comics and the newer approach to comics business model is starting to change. People, own their own properties more often, and so a lot of that injustice, hopefully, is starting to get corrected.
It definitely is, and you see that especially with the. Sorry, I have to shift it forward. Sure. You see that with if you've ever looked at the webcomic, if you look at the online comic community, webcomics is just a pseudo title that's been given to it, but they're all independent. They're all their own creative properties. They all have inspirations, like you had with Kurt Swan. They had similar inspirations with the same people, so they just transferred more to a digital medium that has worked well. But you see a lot of people get burnt out. You see a lot of the turnover factor of creating comics in a digital age now is a lot higher than it was with the comic industry of back in the day.
Yeah.
And either that's due to it's not popular enough, or it's not making money, or it's not. Maybe they lost their passion for what the original content they were doing. Like you see,
probably a combination of all of those things.
Yeah,
it's always a combination of things. If they had found a way to make a living from it, maybe they would have been more content to keep going with it. But if you're working really hard and you feel like you don't have an audience and you can't pay the bills, it's hard to keep yourself enthusiastic about something like that. I mean, I
But
certainly understand that. But what it means is that comics is in. There's a large segment of comics anyway that's in this sort of new Wild West mode where everybody's trying different things. They're trying to figure out the path forward that doesn't go through Marvel and DC's door.
yeah.
And some people are having success with it, but of course, for every success, there's 100 failures because that's just the nature of reconstructing businesses like this. But you see models like Mignola with Hellboy. When you see a guy doing such inspired work for so long and owning it himself, and Jeff Smith's Bone, and all those guys that managed to hit grand slams by following their own vision of what their work should be and who their characters should be, and decided to throw out the old model of working for editors in companies that would own their work. And those models are unfolding every day in things like iPad apps and independent publishers. You see it with, it's possible you see it with things like The Walking Dead comics. You can still manage to hit these things out of the park and find a way to impact the culture just the way Siegel and Schuster did, 75 years ago.
Let's see. You talked about your inspirations. You talked about the younger generation. Let's talk about yourself here. Just a couple more questions, anyhow. You're very successful from a professional standpoint. You've been doing this a good number of years.
That's a relative thing, I got to tell you. I mean, I've got books published, but I'm still trying to find a way to make a good living from this. And so, success is a relative thing, depending on who's looking at it.
Well, what I was going to continue on by saying was,
sure, go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's I've never had anyone jump in like that, so which is good. It's good.
I didn't want to give people the impression that I'm this wildly successful guy who is making money hand over fist and can publish anything he wants. I'm still going through the same struggles as everybody else out there, trying to find venues for my work and trying to find a way to make it pay the bills. So anyway, go ahead.
But, well, then this will flow in pretty nicely to, do you consider yourself personally successful?
I consider, and I sort of compartmentalize all the different things that add up to success. Artistically, I feel pretty successful. I feel like my art has really evolved into something that I'm proud of. I'm certainly successful in that I've got a bunch of books to my credit, which is farther along than a lot of other people who are struggling in this business would say about themselves. So I'm really lucky to have found people who like my work enough to have published it. One great successful part of what I'm doing is I find kids who like my work. That's what it was really all about for me. I got a fan letter from a teacher in a school at the American Embassy School in India, in New Delhi, India. I've gotten letters from people in Africa talking about, hey, I saw your work, I really love it. I get people writing me saying, my kids just love Atomic Ace, they really read those books all the time. Boy, it's hard to find something more gratifying than that, to tell you the truth. That's really what the mission was all about. At the same time, just like everybody else in the world, I'd like to be making more money from the hard work that I'm putting into these things than I am. But you keep plugging, and maybe you do. Maybe you get to that point where you feel like you're making a really good living from this thing, and that all the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. Um, I also try, and the financial part of it is not as successful as I would like it to be. The artistic part of it is, but then again, I'm always looking to improve. I'm always looking to do better. I could be a better writer. I can always be a better artist. There's always panels that you sort of settled for because you didn't know how to do them better. You're always trying to figure out how to ink better, how to um, just do your craft better. And I don't think you ever get to the end of that journey in all likelihood, because you hear guys whose work is vastly superior to you say the same thing. When you hear guys like Will Eisner used to talk to his wife about saying, "Oh, this latest book, I'm not really sure it's that good." You know that everybody has the same creative doubts. But you just work through those and you do your best, and hopefully at the end of the day, you do something that you're proud of. And I'm at the point in my career where I'm really proud of the things that I'm putting out. Dragon Girl, best thing I ever did. For me, it's just a terrific personal achievement to have done a 192-page graphic novel that looks the way I want it to look. It's going to go out to the bookstores and be in Barnes and Noble and available on Amazon and all the kind of different places that kids can find it. And to be able to pass on that traditional action comics that I loved as a kid, man, that's success. Why would you define it as anything else? So, but I have the same doubts about my abilities that every other artist does. And so my failures come in that category.
Well, then I have to ask the second question, so that works out well. Jeff, it's been a pleasure speaking with you here today. It's amazing how much time flies, but
yeah.
Is there anything that I haven't brought out besides the website, which will be posted on your interview page next week, that you'd love for those that are watching or listening to this to know about?
Yeah, it's going to sort of take the form of a plug, but it's an important plug for me. Which is to say that Dragon Girl is a book that kids are really going to like. It's really a great introduction for kids to comics. And it's part of my mission was, because there are so few comics that I find appropriate for my kids when they were growing up, as a father who loved comics and wanted to share them with kids, I ended up reading old comics that I loved to them, rather than the latest, gut-wrenching, angst-ridden story about some homicidal maniac with superpowers. Dragon Girl is made for fathers and mothers who love comics and want to show their kids what that love is about. So that's really what I'd like to get across about the book. Hopefully it'll do that job.
I think so. I really do.
And also it will help me get rich, like I was talking about. The last leg of my success stool. So buy lots of copies of Dragon.
I look forward to seeing it on maybe the next New York Times bestseller. How about that? That would
Sounds good to me.
Well, Jeff, thank you again so much for taking the time to do this interview. It's been a wonderful pleasure having you on yet again, and for the first time, I should say, not yet again.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate your talking with me about this.
Oh, no problem at all. And that ends this episode of Two Geeks Talking. It's crazy. It's episode 378. We're just over halfway through the 42 interviews and 42-day challenge, and of course that was Jeff Weigel from jeffweigel.com. And you can, of course, see this interview as well as many, many, many hundreds of others on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Two Geeks or TGT Media. You can also search for our audio versions of these interviews on our iTunes channel, which is iTunes. Search for two, that's the word two, Geeks Talking. And finally, you can, of course, view all of our interviews and articles and text-based interviews and various video interviews from comic conventions over the past 6 years on our main website, which is tgtmedia.com. And I'm your host, Kurt Sasso, and tune in next time for another wonderful and talented, great, creative person who, I don't know who it is yet, but you will when the interview goes live. Have a great day, everyone.